All right, so this is the next section of Unit 2. This particular set of PowerPoint notes is fairly long, so I'm going to break this into more than one lecture. So you've got properties of water and the importance of water that we've already covered through a lecture video and that hopefully you've already watched. Then the matter cycles, the carbon, water, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. So we're going to tag on to that organisms. And so notice the title of this slide says Interdependence of Organisms. And this is not just going to be of organisms alone. This is going to also be where we're going to connect organisms to their environment. All right, so notice that we're going to be studying ecology. This is the study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environment. So we're going to look at both abiotic and biotic factors with this second unit, right? We're still going to pull back to our first unit, to basic science processes and vocabulary, characteristics of life. Some of those terms will be more important in this unit than others. We will pull back to the taxonomic hierarchy, the biological hierarchy, which we can actually see here, overview of the kingdoms. Okay, so again, that first unit we're going to use all year long. Okay, so that being said, let's just kind of finish with this slide. So we're going to be talking about species a lot. So you've got to know how to write scientific names, how to recognize them, what a species is. So again, it's just a group of organisms that breed and produce fertile offspring, and sometimes you see added to that definition, and they are not members of another species. Okay, notice I just stuck this on here so we could kind of talk about where we're going with this set of notes. So you've got the whole biological hierarchy from left to right, reading from least inclusive to most inclusive, going from atom to biosphere, and we're basically going to start at organism now. Okay, we're going to talk about organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and the biosphere. We'll come back, and not that we won't hit on some of those other terms to the left of organism, but we're going to come back and deal with the cellular and molecular content later on, and then deal with organ systems at the end of the year. Okay, so for this particular PowerPoint, we'll just cover a couple of the slides. Let me just slide this up. Okay, so in the matter cycles notes, one of the things that was discussed is that regardless of which matter cycle we're talking about, that matter can flow in many, or can cycle in many directions. So matter can move from the living component to the non-living component of an ecosystem. It can move from non-living to living, right? It can move between living things, right? From living to living. It can move from non-living to non-living, right? So matter is constantly moving in many directions. It can change forms, right? It just can't be created or destroyed, right? Now, energy is different. Energy is going to flow in one direction, hence why that is all caps, okay? So energy is going to always flow from the sun to producers and then to consumers at different levels, for just kind of a simplistic explanation there, okay? Here's more vocabulary that you've already had, right? So again, a producer or an autotroph is an organism that's going to use the sun's energy to make its own food. So when we get into photosynthesis, that's the process that we're going to talk about, okay? Is that plants, photosynthetic protists, and photosynthetic bacteria are going to be able to take the sun's energy and they're going to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars, okay? And then they're going to take those sugars and they're going to use those sugars to power their own daily activities. They aren't making sugar for you and I or for any other type of heterotroph or specifically consumers or decomposers specifically. They need energy as autotrophs to power their own daily activities as well, okay? So we'll get into the cellular and molecular component of that eventually. Just as a reminder too, that troph means to feed and auto means self. So these are your self feeders. And then heterotrophs, for your two big categories of heterotrophs, again, they can be consumers or decomposers. And hetero means different, and again, troph means to feed. So these are organisms that have to utilize another organism that's different from themselves in order to gain energy, right? Now, consumers and decomposers, those two terms, they are not interchangeable with heterotroph. They are categories under the definition of a heterotroph. Okay, decomposers, the only two types of decomposers are fungus and bacteria, right? And then consumers, like you and I, for example, as members of Kingdom Animalia, are consumers. some protists or heterotrophics, and they are consumers. That's still one that's probably a little bit elusive to you as far as the kingdom Protista goes. More to come on that eventually. Okay, this next thing, primary productivity. Okay, so notice the definition says the rate at which organic matter is created by producers or autotrophs. So this is the rate at which plants are making sugars from the process or through the process of photosynthesis. Okay, and so we're going to look at what does that mean in different ecosystems, right? What are the factors that are going to impact the rate of primary productivity? What are the trends that we see on the Earth's surface as far as that goes, as one component of this unit. All right, and notice there on that graphic it says the primary productivity of an ecosystem depends on a number of interrelated factors, such as light intensity, temperature, nutrient availability, water availability, and mineral supply. And then it also says the most productive ecosystems are systems with high temperatures, plenty of water, and non-limiting supplies of soil nitrogen. So we're going to get into that a little bit more, okay? All right, so when we're talking about primary productivity, the rate at which sugars are made by producers through photosynthesis, the factors that you see here, they are going to dictate that rate. Okay, so geographic location, climate, and other abiotic factors. Okay, so let's talk about geographic location. Essentially, when we look at the equator, right, we are going to see that the sun hits the equator at a direct angle. So it's pretty much hot year-round there, okay, as far as just direct sunlight, right? Remember we already talked about climate, that climate is composed of temperature and precipitation looking over the course of a year, okay? Day-to-day changes in that are weather, right? But the climate near the equator is typically hot and wet year-round, right? And again, there's other abiotic factors that are going to dictate levels of primary productivity overall. But notice when you look at the coloration of this map, other than the fact that the central United States is not colored correctly on here, and we'll talk about that in a second, but notice that at the equator, you've got a lot of green, okay, right around the equator, which is the tropical rainforest. And then notice kind of on either side of that, when you look at the continent of Africa, you've got tropical dry forest. Okay, so notice for both of those, and then you've got tropical savanna, which is in pink above the dry forest down there. You've got some savanna over here in South America as well. Okay, and in Australia. That being said, your tropics are 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. Okay, the tropics of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer. It's not important for you to know which one's which. Okay, so if something is determined to be tropical, it means it has to be between those two lines of latitude, right? And so what we're going to see is that we have really high rates of primary productivity near the equator. And as we move north, let's just say going into the northern hemisphere, or if we move south, going into the southern hemisphere, and then of course we'll just leave Antarctica out of that equation. But as we move away from the equator, primary productivity is typically going to decrease. The rate at which sugars are going to be made through photosynthesis is going to decrease, first and foremost, because the angle of the sun, or the way that the sun hits the earth, is different as you move away from the equator and toward the poles. Right, so we're going to see lower levels of primary productivity as we move into temperate grasslands and deserts and temperate deciduous forest, the taiga or boreal forest, the tundra, for example, all of those that you see listed there. And notice that the tundra in purple is way up close to the North Pole, okay, in northern North America and northern Europe and Asia, for example, okay, very low levels of primary productivity, okay. So that being said, abiotic factors dictate how much photosynthesis takes place. And then in turn, the level of primary productivity, how much sugar is made through photosynthesis, that's going to determine the number of species or the biodiversity in a given biome. So overall, on land, we see our highest numbers of species, okay, living in the tropical rainforest. And then the tropical dry forest and savanna, for example, we see really low levels of species diversity in the tundra. Maybe a little bit more in the taiga, okay, more in the temperate deciduous forest where we live, that kind of light purple there. Okay, now the middle of the United States should be this yellow, this temperate grassland, and I really like this map for other regions of the world. I don't really know why it's not colored there, so just imagine that temperate grassland is here. Okay, so that being said, abiotic factors dictate primary productivity levels. Primary productivity levels dictate overall biodiversity levels in a given ecosystem. Okay, so then when we look at that, and we look at the next slide, okay, we're going to kind of transition to the fact that we know we've got to have autotrophs to carry out photosynthesis and make sugar. Then we've got to talk about different types of heterotrophs. So these are, some of these you probably know already, some of them you may not. So let's start with that vor means to feed, okay, that suffix. Okay, so you might want to write that down or add that somewhere, okay. That means to feed, right? Herb is going to refer to a plant, essentially, okay? So these are going to be animals that consume only plants, right? And you've got a few examples there, squirrels, rabbits, deer, and a manatee, just as an aquatic example, okay? Carna means flesh, okay, or meat, okay? And so these are going to be animals that are going to consume only meat, a lion, a wolf, a grizzly bear, a fox, okay? And then omnivores, omni means kind of universal, a little bit of everything essentially. Omnivores are going to consume both plants and animals. Notice you've got a different bear listed here because black bears are omnivores, like they eat a lot of berries, okay? I stuck us in here even though we want to remove ourselves from the equation for the most part, but we are designed to be omnivorous. Our tooth structure, we've got teeth that grind, like your molars, for example, and can grind up plant material really well. We've got our canine teeth that are designed to tear flesh. Then you've got your incisors that are designed to bite into food as well. Okay, so even if somebody says that they are a vegetarian, for example, okay, by natural design, they are an omnivore, even though they're choosing not to eat meat, let's say. Possums, raccoons, okay, just as a couple of examples. I'm going to skip detritivore for a minute and go to decomposer because that's one that you should know. So decomposers, again, are only fungus and bacteria, right? And they break down dead organisms and return nutrients to the soil. They're going to go through the process of breaking those down externally and then absorb the nutrients into their body. So they're considered external heterotrophs, where anything that's a consumer and puts food into a hole or an orifice, like your mouth, is a internal heterotroph, okay, digesting food internally. So herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores that we've already talked about, they are internal heterotrophs. Decomposers are external heterotrophs. And that is stated in your kingdom chart, okay, as far as just one place that it says that. All right, so let's talk about detritivores because this tends to confuse people, okay? So detritus is basically dead, breaking down organic matter. Like if you go out on a hike in the woods and there are leaves on the forest floor and they are really decayed and broken down already, that's considered detritus, okay? So worms, for example, crabs, slugs, things like that, they are detritivores. So they are feeding on this dead matter that is being decomposed by some sort of fungus or bacteria. It's in the process of being decomposed, but they're going to actually be consumers and take it into their bodies, even if it's already partially decomposed, okay? So they're kind of a confusing one, and they can, a lot of times they're shown in lots of different places on food chains and food webs, okay? Then scavengers, they are essentially animals that are going to consume animals that are already dead. Okay, so vultures, there are only true scavenger around here, so they're going to kind of circle maybe over a dead animal and then, you know, fly down and pick it apart like a dead deer. Think of if you've seen an animal on the side of the road that's been hit by a car and then you happen to see a vulture feeding on it, okay? And then hyenas, like the mean dogs in the Lion King, okay? They are scavengers, right? And they feed a little bit differently. They're not necessarily always strict scavengers, but these are specifically consumers that consume already dead animals. They aren't going to hunt for food typically when they're defined as being a scavenger. Okay, so around here our only example is a vulture. All right, so then we're going to use a lot of that vocabulary to talk about food chains and food webs and the transfer of energy among organisms within ecosystems. Okay, so your definition of a food chain, which you can see there, one there on the right, it's a series of steps in which organisms are going to transfer energy by eating or being eaten. Okay, then when you put a whole bunch of food chains together and interconnect them, you can get a food web. All right, so food web is going to better represent what's actually happening in an ecosystem than a single food chain does. And in the grand scheme of things, no pictorial representation that we ever see of either of these really gets at the whole picture of what's happening in nature. Okay, but they can give us a little snapshot of correct feeding relationships. Okay, so again, a food web is going to interconnect food chains. Remember, we already said troph means to feed. Okay, so trophic levels. These are the steps in a food chain or a food web. Okay, so here we see 5 trophic levels. We see a producer level, okay, and then we see what's called a primary consumer, and then a secondary consumer when we move up to the Arctic cod, a tertiary consumer with the ringed seal, and then the polar bear would be a quaternary consumer. And that's about as long as a food chain can be. We'll talk about that more in just a second. Okay, so that being said, some of that vocabulary is right here. Okay, so again, these aren't going to get at the whole picture, but they do depict simple feeding relationships in nature. All right, so it says that the first bullet, not that one, but this one down here, it says organisms depicted in a food chain or a food web are going to represent the entire population of that organism. So the snake over here, whatever kind of snake it is, it's representing the entire population of that snake, or the entire population of this squirrel. Okay, the arrows are always drawn in the direction of energy flow. Okay, so from what is being consumed to what is doing the eating or the consuming. So the pointy part of the arrow is going to be the destination of the energy. Okay, the energy starts here in this plant, and then when the mouse consumes it, the energy ends up here, right? And I always give the analogy of that you guys, if you don't already have your learner's permit, that you will probably have it sometime within this year for a lot of you, and that if you are following directions on the road and you saw an arrow, or just like walking down the hall here and saw an arrow, that if the arrow points in a certain direction that you need to go, you would follow that arrow to get to your destination. Okay, if we flip this arrow or any of these arrows around, but we'll just talk about this one, if we flip this one between the plant and the mouse, it implies that the plant eats the mouse, right? So arrows are always drawn in the direction of energy flow. Where's the energy going to end up? Okay, let's see here. So it says each consumer in a food chain or a food web depends on the trophic level below it for energy. Right, your primary consumers are typically going to be herbivorous. They could be omnivores, right, but a lot of them are going to be herbivores. Right, so notice here, the mouse, okay, that's a primary consumer if we follow that food chain. The grasshopper is a primary consumer if we follow 2 food chains. Then we've got the rabbit and the squirrel are both primary consumers over here. Okay, notice if we follow from the plant to the grasshopper to the mouse, then the mouse becomes a secondary consumer. Okay, so going to that definition, so a secondary consumer, they're going to be omnivores and carnivores depending on where they fall in the food chain or the food web. Okay, if it's a food web, then again, like the mouse here, then organisms can typically serve more than one role, right? So it depends on, within a food web, which chain you follow to be able to label organisms as, are they definitely only shown as primary consumers, or are they shown as secondary and primary, maybe secondary and tertiary? Okay, so if we were to follow from the plant to the grasshopper to the frog, that's a secondary consumer. If we go straight to the owl's a tertiary consumer. Right? If we go from the frog to the snake becomes the tertiary consumer, and then we go to the owl, and the owl becomes a quaternary consumer, which is not on here, but let me write that. Okay, so that being said, Get my spelling right. Okay, so that's your fourth level consumer. Okay, so you've got primary, secondary, tertiary, and then quaternary, right? And that's about as far as you can go. And we'll talk about that in just a second as well, okay? All right, so one more thing here. So certain animals are going to be strict herbivores in nature, okay? Like that grasshopper or that squirrel, for example. Some organisms are going to be strict omnivores. They're going to eat some plants and some animals. And then others are, of course, going to be strict carnivores. They eat only other animals, like that snake, for example. Snakes don't eat plants, okay? So when you take a food web and you start applying those other types of terms to it, herbivore, carnivore, etc., then you're putting two different kind of sets of information together to get a bigger picture. All right, so then we are going to add to that, with food chains and food webs, we can also add the ecological pyramids. Okay, so notice the definition. It's the broad definition that there's three types of ecological pyramids. So they're diagrams that show the relative amounts of either energy or matter contained within each trophic level in a food chain or a food web. All right, so we can take a food chain or a food web in an ecological pyramid and talk about those things together, even though the notes aren't really laid out that way, okay? So let's start with the energy pyramid, and then I'm going to jump back to that other picture, to either the food chain or the food web. So an energy pyramid is going to depict just that, the amount of energy at each trophic level, okay? So energy is the factor that determines the length of a food chain. That's why I said quaternary consumer is about as far as you can go, and we'll give a mathematical example in just a minute. So only about 10%, that's just your rule to go by, only about 10% of the energy that's present in a given trophic level is going to be passed on to the next level, okay? The remaining 90% is going to be used by the organism to power daily activities, and then some of that's going to be lost as heat to the environment as those activities are taking place, okay, through the process of cellular respiration, which we will talk about at the same time as far as our unit on cellular energy when we talk about photosynthesis, okay? So that being said, it's your 10% rule for how much energy goes to the next trophic level, okay? So let me give you an example real quick. All right, so let's just pretend, and I just totally made this number up, that at the level of the producers in a given food chain or food web, that there's 5,462 kilocalories of energy available, right? So let's go with, on the last slide, or let's go with actually the picture with the algae and the shrimp going up to the polar bear, okay? So if at the level of the algae, there were 5,462 kilocalories, let me see if I can squeeze that in here too. Nope, I can't. Hang on just a second. I'm going to see if I can rig this up. All right, now we can see that particular food chain. So let's say again at the level of the algae, we've got 5,462 kilocalories of energy. That means that for the shrimp, okay, there's going to be 546.2 kilocalories, right? 10% of 5,462 is 546.2. So to calculate 10% in your head, all you do is move a decimal place one place to the left. Okay, and I'm not going to let you use a calculator for 10% calculations. This is kind of a life skill, right? That being said, let's go on to the Arctic cod. That means that then there are 54.62 kilocalories at the level of the cod. Okay, for the ringed seal, then there are 5.462 kilocalories. And then at the polar bear level, there's 0.546 kilocalories. Notice I've written kilocalories every level. Sorry, that's getting messy, right? Because you always have to have units. Your numbers are meaningless without them, okay? But that being said, the polar bear, notice we're getting close to 0% energy available to that polar bear, okay? So essentially, energy runs out is how you want to think of it in the grand scheme of things, okay? And again, you just move the decimal place one place to the left, right, to calculate 10% of something. Okay, and again, that's a good life skill. Like if you are going to buy a shirt at the store and it's $55, you can kind of say in Hoover that tax is essentially 10%. Okay, so if it's $55, you really need $60.50 to cover the cost of that shirt. Or if you're trying to buy something on sale, and you calculate it's a 30%, say, the item is 30% off and it's $55. Well, $5.50 is 10%, so then multiply that times 3, okay, and that's $16.50 you're going to save off of that shirt. But then you have to tack back on the 10% tax, okay? So again, this is kind of a basic life skill, like tipping at a restaurant, things like that. And I want you to pretend that you don't have a phone, is my whole point in kind of bringing all of that up, because you're not going to be able to use a calculator for me. All right, and so one more thing on the energy pyramid, again, that the other 90% of the energy is used to power daily activities. Okay, so as 10% moves to the next level, 90% of that energy at a given level is gone to daily activities, and some of it being lost as heat through cellular respiration. Okay, and we'll look at the pictures in just a minute of energy, biomass, and numbers pyramids all together. So the biomass pyramid, this represents the amount of food that's available at each trophic level in an ecosystem. And biomass, by definition, is the amount of living tissue or organic matter within a given trophic level. And the way I always say to think about biomass is that if you were to remove all of the water, and this should sound kind of familiar, all of the water from an organism, then all you have remaining is biomass, okay? The actual hard, maybe soft, but the actual hard structural tissue that makes up the organism. The water's gone. So you can really only calculate biomass with dead organisms. You can't calculate it when anything's truly alive, okay? And so we've kind of looked at that with our lab. Let's see. Then the next thing, and we'll look at that picture in just a minute. Then the numbers pyramid, this is just pretty simple. It's based on the number of individuals at each trophic level, and the number of individuals is going to decrease as you go up the pyramid. And actually biomass decreases as you go up the pyramid as well. They all do. Okay, so let's look at the pictures. So we've already talked a little bit more in detail about the energy pyramid, but there you've got a nice little graphic of that showing the 10% rule actually starting with the number 100%. Here's the biomass pyramid, that again, this is just your true mass, no water involved, that at the base of the pyramid, if we say we've got 1,500 grams of grain, then as we move up the pyramid to the chickens that are feeding on that, and then if you were to eat a piece of chicken for dinner, okay, that the amount of biomass at each given level, like at the human level, the chicken level, or the corn level here, that the amount of biomass is going to decrease as we move up the pyramid, okay? And then the numbers pyramid, the same way. You've got tons of plants shown in the bottom of the pyramid. We've got fewer herbivores, right, like mice and rabbits and grasshoppers. We've got fewer snakes than we do mice, rabbits, and grasshoppers. And then we've got only one hawk shown. Okay, so it takes a whole lot of plants to feed a few herbivores. It takes a whole lot of mass of those plants, kind of tying that to the biomass pyramid. It takes a whole lot of plants, sorry, I feel like I'm getting dizzy there. A whole lot of mass and numbers of individuals to feed the primary consumer level, okay? Then it takes a decent number of rabbits and mice and what have you, and the mass that they make up to feed the next level, all right, until we move all the way up to the top with our fewest numbers of individuals at the top of the numbers pyramid, the least amount of biomass and the least amount of energy available. But it's energy that's going to dictate the length of a food chain or a food web, because it essentially runs out eventually. It only flows in one direction and therefore is going to run out. Okay, so that's going to be the end of that section. I know that was kind of long, but just had a lot of things to explain there. Let me know if you have any questions.